China and Russia's improving relationship has become an increasing concern for U.S. policymakers. While the two U.S. rivals could pose a formidable threat in theory, their so called no limits partnership is often overhyped in Washington. A new defense priorities paper argues that it is U.S. foreign policy that is, in fact, the main driver of the China Russia quasi alliance. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'll be speaking with Lyle Goldstein. He's the author of that paper, and he directs the Asia program at Defense Priorities. Lyle and I are going to talk about what a better U.S. approach to China and Russia would look like. Here are three things you need to know. Hey, Lyle, thanks for joining me today to talk about your new paper on the China Russia quasi alliance. I'm wondering if you can just start off by walking through the argument you make in the paper that this kind of vaunted no limits partnership that they often hype up in Washington isn't quite as tight of a relationship or an alliance as is often portrayed. So, can you explain to us what the argument you make in the paper on that?
Yeah, Adam, thanks for doing this. Happy to share some thoughts on the on what I term a quasi-alliance. I mean, let me say at the outset, I do think this relationship, this bilateral relationship between these two Eurasian giants is of great importance, and I do think it's both broad and deep. So I don't sort of view it as a marriage of convenience, really, but still, it is worth pointing out that there are many limits that constrain that relationship, and I think this gives us strong reason to believe that it won't develop into a full up kind of strong alliance that we would, the kind that would kind of keep us up at night. So, let me list a few factors here. One is the historical memory. I mean, in
Yeah.
effect, they were here before in the 1950s. They did have a really strong bilateral alliance, and it really blew up in their face. We could talk about some of the reasons why, but I mean, after a couple of decades of vitriolic insults, they were literally on the verge of war, and that partly occurred because they were sort of too interconnected, too interdependent. In a painful way. So I think both powers are anxious to avoid that. And one way to avoid that is to sort of not depend on each other too much, not to become too involved, not to put too much stock in it, to be more self-reliant. Second, they have really fundamentally different interests. I mean, we all know China is obsessed with Taiwan and the South China Sea, and Russia has really no interest in the South China Sea or having to do with Taiwan, and the reverse is also true. China has no major interest in Ukraine or the Baltic Sea or anything like that. So, in effect, the two countries have very different concerns and priorities. There is kind of that they have sort of sympathy for one another, but it doesn't really go beyond that, and that really kind of rules out the worst case scenario, which is that they would cooperate in a war. I mean, China is not. We've seen that in the Ukraine case. Look, they also both want to avoid antagonism with the United States. That's clear, and certainly, I think China here has been most clear in saying, no, creating an alliance or kind of an anti-Western bloc would just be very contrary to China's long-run interest. In effect, they want to avoid a new Cold War, and they know that if they went into a very strong alliance. Just as in the first Cold War, right? That was one of the first developments in that first Cold War, and boy, did it heat up fast. They know that, and then they want to avoid that. And finally, we can also say that they, in a way, both of them are concerned about the United States, but they also know, because they have strong nuclear forces and so forth, that they regard the United States as somewhat threatening, but not, but something that they can handle without going into that strong alliance. It's just they don't see it as necessary.
Well, that's a good lead into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is another central part of your paper, which is how is it that U.S. foreign policy is in fact driving these two together and helping to kind of improve their relationship?
Mm-hmm. Right, and I do think that we have to keep that in mind. So, while I just made the case that we don't have to worry too much, On the other hand, there are things to be concerned about. And I think we have to hold out there. It's unlikely, but it's possible that the two countries could join up in a even more serious lashing up that involved military technology cooperation that would be troubling, let's say, for the United States. So one way we can prevent that is to kind of stop driving them together. And if you look at the process of this really goes back to the 1990s, but we have in effect challenged both Moscow and Beijing, challenged their core interests, their vital interests. You can go back to the 1995, 96 Taiwan Strait crisis. Since that time, China has been preparing actively for a Taiwan contingency.
Yeah.
And Russia's situation is not that different, right? And here it was the wars in the former Yugoslavia, the bombing of Belgrade, and then the process of NATO expanding over a long period of time. And so what that did was it created like enormous strains in both the U.S.-Russian relationship that developed in a terrible way, and the same, in parallel has occurred on the other side of the planet, in the other side of Eurasia, with China. And so, as both relationships have been in a really terrible and I would say even tragic place, as a result, the logic of world politics is such that you have a very kind of smooth and dynamic China-Russia relationship, and that's what we've seen. And it has, like I said at the outset of this discussion, that relationship is both broad and deep. Really, for over 3 decades, they have built something rather substantive. It's not just for show. Now I'm not particularly concerned about that at this point, and I think that Moscow and Beijing in particular has shown restraint in this regard. Like I said, they know that they could take it too far, and that would be destabilizing. But how to put it, if we embark on a new Cold War, if we take steps that antagonize both these countries to that extent, then they are, if you will, they have their contingency plan for that unfortunate development. I think we need to try very hard to avoid that.
If I could just ask a follow-on question to this one, I'm wondering what you think about things like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, how they fit into this picture, because they're often presented in Washington as this attempt by, they're presented as sort of like China and Russia-led organizations that are aiming to build an alternative to the Western-led order. So how do you see those kind of, blocks or groupings that China and Russia are leading playing into this bigger issue of the U.S. pushing China and Russia together?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think they should be dismissed. I think something is going on there, and I think part of it is simply both Russia and China have realized that they can harvest a lot of goodwill in the global South, partly again due often to U.S. missteps. I mean, these wars in the Middle East, for example, tend to fire up all kinds of excitement in the global South for cooperating with somebody else. What is the alternative to the West?
Well, and also because of just the impacts that these wars have on global vulnerable populations in the global South, right?
Exactly right. So
Yeah.
a lot of it is just pragmatic. We want
Right.
to do trade with people who want to trade, not people who are threatened to put sanctions on one day or the next. So yeah, there's a certain pragmatic quality to it. But I think it does go somewhat beyond that, where both sides are kind of China in particular, I think, is kind of interested in the longer run institutions that could result and could be favorable to China, particularly in the commercial realm. But I mean, it should be said that we've seen hardly any kind of military, let's say, military spin-offs in either the
Right.
BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation. Here and there, they'll do sort of small exercises. They tend to be like counterterrorism and very small in scale. So, and I think that's done by design. I mean, again, if China wanted to put on large scale exercises with these partners, it could, but I think they realize again that that would be destabilizing and probably sort of contrary to, like I said, China wants to, they really want to avoid this new Cold War, and so they want to develop the BRICS and other organizations like that in ways that are not threatening and are genuinely inclusive.
Yeah. So, can you end today by talking through what you think a better U.S. approach to its relations with China and Russia would look like? And I'm wondering if you can also kind of talk about these terms that you discuss at length in the paper, the reverse Kissinger, and then also the double Kissinger, and how that could come into play in this in U.S. foreign policy with Russia and China.
Yeah, these are somewhat handy terms for talking about complex dynamics of world politics here.
Yeah.
Last year, in 2025 in particular, when the Trump administration first came in and was really kind of rethinking what to do on the Ukraine war, and when Presidents Trump and Putin met in Alaska and so forth, there was a lot of talk about a so-called reverse Kissinger that would involve.
Hmm.
Well, why reverse Kissinger? Because back in the early 70s, when Kissinger paved the way for a totally new relationship with China, subsequently, that was quite helpful in ending the Cold War on favorable terms, because it really isolated the Soviet Union, and caused many difficulties for the USSR. So many have trumpeted that as a great strategy that could be used in reverse, meaning in this time, instead of softening relations with China against Russia, effectively now it would be softening relations with Russia to
Right.
try to turn them against China. I'm skeptical of this for many, many reasons, not least that if you look at the actual history of what Kissinger did, he was looking to simultaneously improve relations with both countries. And actually, he succeeded for several years.
Yeah.
There was a major lowering of tension, the period of détente,
To
we
time.
call it.
Yeah.
And that was extremely successful. It was only later that it came to be associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union by kind of drawing resources, making the USSR spread its resources around. But when we talk in this explainer, we advocate for a double Kissinger. What does that mean? I mean, in fact, this means improving relations with both Moscow and Beijing also. And by the way, in some ways, I think by hook or by crook, actually, the Trump administration seems to be coming around in a way to this policy, and that's just it's probably just not grand strategy per se, but more just kind of pragmatism. Guess what? China's very important. So is Russia. You probably want to have a working relationship with both. That is my basic logic, but it goes further than that. I mean, both countries have so much sway around the world that you really can lower tensions across the board in so many regions, from the Arctic to Latin America to the Middle East. And let's not forget, that nuclear danger there. So if you want to lower the danger of some kind of catastrophic conflict, including use of nuclear weapons, the best way to do it is to try to improve our
Yeah.
relationships, get back to pragmatism with both China and Russia. And I do see this occurring to some extent. I like to see a more energetic push on both fronts, but I am modestly pleased um, with how diplomacy with both Beijing and Moscow are developing. I like to see more. Of course, the most fundamentally, right, the biggest problems clearly are the Ukraine war on the one hand and Taiwan on the other. So
Right.
I do argue in the paper that we should focus on these two issues, not instead of putting them aside. We need to deal with them up front, and try to use skillful diplomacy to to remove these huge obstacles to greater cooperation and lowering tensions.
Well, great. Thanks a lot for sharing your analysis and insights today, Lyle. I want to encourage everybody to go to defensepriorities.org untitled.org and check out your new paper, and also check out your new book on this topic, which is very relevant, a new Cold War at Sea, to get even more insights on this complicated but really important topic for international relations today. Thanks a lot, Lyle.
Thanks a lot, Adam.